Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. Before I begin, I want to make a brief statement on something that is admittedly not within the scope of this particular hearing, but is very important to my district and agriculture producers across the country. With the 45Z clean fuel production credit going into effect in less than 5 months, Nebraska's agriculture and energy producers need full and accurate guidance promptly. I was disappointed to see Treasury release guidance in April for the 40B Sustainable Aviation Fuel Credit that rejected the best available scientific data and tied the hands of our nation's ag producers with an unworkable one-size-fits-all limitation. Nebraska's farmers don't need the federal government to come in at the 11th hour and dictate which practices are acceptable and not acceptable. And I will continue to advocate for greater flexibility that fully recognizes the role Nebraska's producers play in the future of transportation fuels and for an all-of-the-above energy policy that puts our farmers first. I plan to submit some questions, Madam Secretary, for the record on this issue and would appreciate a quick response. Switching gears, Secretary Yellen, in response to a letter from Chairman McHenry, among others, regarding FSOC's calls to fill the spot market gap in digital assets, it was noted that, quote, crypto asset platforms engage in practices commonly subjected to greater regulation, including operating order book style markets and custodying crypto customer assets, end quote. Those activities sound a lot like activities undertaken by centralized intermediaries, and centralized intermediaries are undoubtedly an important piece of the regulatory puzzle for digital asset regulation. That's why this committee and the Ag Committee collaborated together on Fit for the 21st Century, which provides a new regulatory framework with sufficient responsibility and resources for the CFTC to effectively regulate spot markets for digital assets that are not securities. However, I think it's important that we think about some of the unique characteristics in decentralized systems as well. These protocols will allow willing buyers or willing sellers to find one another and make a trade based on the rules of the protocol to any of the market participants. Here's my question. How do you think about decentralized trading protocols that do not create order book style markets or involve the custody of customers' crypto assets? Wouldn't these markets, which are unique relative to most of our understanding of traditional centralized markets, require a different approach to regulation?
You're talking about DeFi type of activities and...
We have to recognize there's going to be a decentralized angle to all of this in digital assets, and so far everything seems very centralized, so yes.
Your question is, what about the regulatory approach to those markets?
Well, how are you thinking, when you look at this whole regulatory regime, how do you think about decentralized trading protocols, basically, that do not create order book style markets or involve the custody of a customer's crypto assets? Have you given that a lot of thought?
Well, this is certainly something that the regulators are looking at, the SEC and to some extent the CFTC. Perhaps some of these activities may fall under the regulatory umbrella of the banking agencies as well. And
I would add this, Madam Secretary. FSOC released a report in late 2023 dedicated an entire section to the risk associated with digital assets. One such risk the report mentioned was, quote unquote, concentrated risk. I'd like to focus on a couple aspects of concentration risk that I'd like your view on. If there are only a small number of entities that are able to serve as custodians of digital assets for registered investment advisors, would you agree that such an arrangement could constitute a concentration risk?
it could potentially, but I'd need to know more about the details.
I will note that a witness representing the registered investment advisors spoke in front of the Digital Assets Subcommittee panel early last year and testified that his firm had, quote, 3, maybe 4, end quote, options for digital assets custody currently, and indicated the number could reduce with the SEC's custody rulemaking. I guess, Madam Secretary, in the time I have left, if there are only a small number of entities that are able to serve as custodians of the now approved spot Bitcoins ETFs, would you view that arrangement as a potential concentration risk?
I just have to know more about the details. I'd need to really look carefully at the case you have in mind.
I will leave with this. I emphasize there are only a handful of custodians for spot Bitcoin ETFs, and most issuers only have one custodian. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for your time.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston.